Welcome back to the 2024 edition of my Security Plus Exam Cram series. This is continuing coverage of Domain 1, and here in Section 1.2, we'll focus on fundamental security concepts. We'll begin with a look at the CIA Triad. We'll then have a look at the concepts behind AAA, authentication, authorization, and accounting. We're then going to have a look at gap analysis, our first foray into audit strategy and benefits. Then we're going to dive deep into zero trust in the context of NIST's latest guidance on the topic. We're then going to have a look at principles of physical security, and we'll look at an array of physical security controls, really building on that previous session on security control categories and types. And we'll finish our session today with disruption and deception technologies designed to distract attackers. Lots of practical security knowledge here, so let's get started. Welcome back to the Security Plus Exam Cram 2024 edition with continuing coverage of Domain 1 of the latest exam revision. In this installment, covering subdomain 1.2 of the SY0-701 exam. Section 1.2 asks us to summarize fundamental security concepts. So read that as foundational concepts that apply across all security vendors. So 1.2 begins with the CIA Triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability, non-repudiation, authentication, authorization, and accounting, sometimes called the AAA protocols. We'll dig into authenticating people, systems, and authorization models here. The purpose and outcomes of a gap analysis. We're going to go deep on zero trust, both at the control plane and the data plane. And the language we see here tells us that CompTIA is pulling a page from NIST's special publication 800-207, which covers zero trust. So we see the terminology listed here for zero trust represented directly in NIST's industry standard document. We'll dive into the elements of physical security, touching on bollards, access control vestibules, fencing, lighting, guards, cameras, and we'll touch on 4 types of sensors. Even if you've been around security for a while, those may not all be clear to you, so we'll dive deep on those. And we'll wrap up 1.2 with deception and disruption technology, the honeypot, honeynet, and supporting components. And what do we see in that physical security topic? We see security controls. So I want you to be thinking about control categories and control types as we go through this content, reinforcing what you learned in our previous installment. So let's dive into the CIA Triad, which as a security professional you should know by heart. So CIA stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. We see it represented in the triangle 1, 2, and 3, beginning with confidentiality. So access controls help ensure that only authorized subjects can access objects. We'll dig a little deeper in this session, but think of subjects as people and objects as resources, such as data, for the moment. Next, we have integrity, which ensures that data or system configurations are not modified without authorization, that the file sent exactly matches the file received, that the system files on an operating system are not modified without authorization, and availability, because authorized requests for objects must be granted to subjects within a reasonable amount of time. Confidentiality and integrity have no value without availability. Next, we have non-repudiation, which guarantees that no one can deny a transaction. And the most common method to provide non-repudiation are digital signatures, which prove that a digital message or document was not modified intentionally or unintentionally from the time it was signed. That document could be an email message, a contract, any artifact that's part of a transaction. Digital signatures are actually based on asymmetric cryptography, a public-private key pair. It's the digital equivalent of a handwritten signature or a stamped seal. And it provides non-repudiation in a publicly verifiable manner, the public key. Stated another way, non-repudiation is the ability of one party to defeat or counter a false rejection or refusal of the other of an obligation with irrefutable evidence. So the digital signature on that message, on that e-signing of a contract, gives us a publicly verifiable assertion that both of these parties were involved in the transaction and it cannot be denied. Side note, do remember that shared accounts and identities prevent non-repudiation. Simple example, if I have a Twitter account and 3 people have access using the same credentials, I can't prove who posted a tweet ever. We'll often hear the concept of AAA mentioned in the context of several protocols that provide authentication, authorization, and accounting services, and we'll touch on those protocols here and there throughout the series, but I want to focus right now on these 3 concepts. So we have authentication, where a user or service proves identity with some type of credentials, like a username and a password. And then we have authorization, where the authenticated users are granted access to resources based on the roles and/or permissions assigned to their identity. And accounting refers to the methods that track user activity and records these activities in logs. It tracks user activity and resource access as part of the audit trail. And these 3 concepts really are prefaced by a 4th. They go hand in hand, so I want to take another pass at this from a slightly different angle. Let's talk about identification and authentication. So identification is where a subject claims an identity, and identification could be as simple as a username for a user, as simple as an Active Directory account. And authentication, again, where the subject proves their identity by providing authentication credentials, the matching password for a username, for example. And this leads to authorization. So after authenticating subjects, systems can authorize access to objects based on their proven identity. And then there's accountability. Auditing logs and audit trails record events, including the identity of the subject that performed the action. So we have authorization that comes after authentication and accountability that provides proof of it all. So identification plus authentication plus auditing gives us accountability. So why is accountability important? Let's go through the hows to get to the why. So accountability is maintained for individual subjects using auditing. Logs record user activities, and users can be held accountable for their logged actions. So how does this help us? Well, it directly promotes good user behavior and compliance with the organization's security policies. Generally speaking, users are going to behave when they know their actions are being audited, when they are being logged, and it provides an audit trail for investigation if the fact that we're logging doesn't deter that bad behavior. Or if, heaven forbid, we have a security breach, a compromised identity, we're going to have that audit trail so we can go back and piece together the sequence of events. And this discussion can extend beyond users to systems and devices as well. It's common in modern enterprises that systems and devices will have identities also. 2 good examples: virtual machines in the cloud will have a managed identity managed by the platform, created and deleted with the VM, sharing its life cycle, and used by the VM when it accesses resources such as data. So we have an audit trail. And client devices will often have machine identities in a mobile device platform, often tied back to the identity provider platform. And that can be leveraged to make decisions around authentication and authorization of the user on the device. Which brings us to our next topic, authorization models. So you want to be familiar with all these models for the exam, beginning with non-discretionary access control, which enables the enforcement of system-wide restrictions that override object-specific access control. Role-based access control is an example of a non-discretionary authorization model. In discretionary access control, every object has an owner, and the owner can grant or deny access to any other subject at their discretion. This model is considered to be use-based and user-centric. A good example of discretionary access control is the NTFS file system on Windows, widely used for more than a couple of decades now. Next, we have role-based access control, a key characteristic of which is the use of roles or groups. So instead of assigning permissions directly to users, the user accounts are placed in roles and administrators assign privileges to the roles. These are typically mapped to job roles. Then we have rule-based access control. A key characteristic is that it applies global rules to all subjects. The rules within this model are sometimes referred to as restrictions or filters. A good example of rule-based access control is a firewall that uses rules that allow or block traffic to all users equally. And finally, we have mandatory access control. A key point about mandatory access control is that every object and every subject has one or more labels. These labels are predefined and the system determines access based on assigned labels. An example of mandatory access control that comes immediately to mind is military security, where the data owner doesn't set access. If data is top secret, they don't determine who has top secret clearance. Nor is that individual data owner allowed to down-classify data, so they couldn't down-classify data from top secret to secret just to allow someone access. And next we have attribute-based access control, where access is restricted based on an attribute on the account, such as department, location, or functional designation. For example, admins may require user accounts have the legal department attribute in order to view contracts. Now, just to be sure you're clear for the exam, let's touch on subjects and objects directly. Key concepts in access control for sure. So subjects are the users, groups, and services accessing resources known as objects. And the objects are the resources, files, folders, shares, printers, databases, any resources being accessed by the subject. And the authorization model determines how a system grants users access to files and other resources. But these two come up pretty often in discussions of access control, so just make sure you have them straight in your head for the exam. The syllabus also calls out gap analysis, which is a common task performed on a recurring basis and often in preparation for external audits. So in a gap analysis, auditors will often follow a standard like ISO 27001 and compare standard requirements to the organization's current operations. And deficiencies versus the standard will be captured in the audit report as gaps, sometimes called control gaps. A control gap is a discrepancy between the security measures an organization should have in place versus the controls they actually have in place. The outcome is an attestation, which is a formal statement made by the auditor on the controls and processes in place and as to whether or not they are sufficient. And both internal and external auditors should have independence in the audit process, but attestations from external auditors tend to carry more weight, higher confidence, because the auditor is not employed directly by the organization. Zero trust is called out in great detail in section 1.2 on the syllabus. So zero trust is an approach to security architecture in which no entity is trusted by default. And zero trust is based on three principles: assume breach, verify explicitly, and least privilege access. Zero Trust has largely replaced the old trust but verify model, which was based on a network perimeter strategy, where everything inside the perimeter was automatically trusted, and it's supported by Defense in Depth that advises a layered approach to security. To think about it another way, Zero Trust really addresses the limitations of that legacy network perimeter-based security model. It treats identity as the control plane, and it assumes compromise and breach in verifying every request. Again, no entity is trusted by default. In Zero Trust, we verify identity, we manage devices and apps, and we protect data. So let's talk access policy enforcement in the context of Zero Trust. We have the policy enforcement point, which is responsible for enabling monitoring and terminating connections between a subject, like a user or a device, and an enterprise resource. The policy enforcement point acts as the gateway that enforces access control policies. So when an access request occurs, the policy enforcement point evaluates the request against predefined policies and applies the necessary controls. For example, a policy enforcement point might enforce multi-factor authentication for access requests from unexpected locations, which would imply that enforcement is dynamic based on conditions and context around the request at the time of the request. And then we have the policy decision point, which is where access decisions are made based on various factors like user identity, device health, and risk assessment. The PDP evaluates the context of an access request and decides whether it should be allowed, denied, or subjected to additional controls. The policy decision point considers the 5 W's: who, what, when, where, and why. But to state it in short, the policy enforcement point enforces policies at the connection level, while the policy decision point makes access decisions based on contextual information. The exam syllabus calls out several key elements of zero trust network architecture in the control plane and the data plane. So in the control plane, we have adaptive identity, threat scope reduction, policy-driven access control, policy administrator, and policy engine you'll need to be familiar with. This drives the policy-based decision logic for zero trust. In the data plane, we have implicit trust zones, subject and system, and policy enforcement point. So this enforces the decisions defined in the control plane. If you're wondering where these elements of zero trust network architecture come from, they are described in detail in NIST Special Publication 800-207. Let's unpack all of these, beginning with the control plane. Adaptive identity changes the way the system asks a user to authenticate based on the context of the request. So the policy decision point is going to look at elements like location, the device the user is coming from. Is that device healthy? Are they using an approved app? Is there any risk associated with this user? Threat scope reduction is really an end goal of zero trust network architecture, which is to decrease risks to the organization. Policy-driven access control, which are controls based on a user's identity rather than simply their system's location. Probably the most popular policy-driven access control out there is conditional access in Microsoft's Entra ID, formerly Azure Active Directory, which is used with Office 365. In fact, I'll show you around a conditional access policy here in just a moment so you can get a sense of what a system like that looks like. And we have the policy administrator, responsible for communicating the decisions made by the policy engine. This is an element of the system, not a human person. And then we have the policy engine, which decides whether to grant access to a resource for a given subject. Another example here is Entra ID, the identity platform used with Office 365. But the policy administrator and the policy engine together make up the policy decision point. Moving on to the data plane. We have implicit trust zones, which are part of traditional security approaches in which firewalls and other security devices formed a perimeter. Systems belonging to the organization were placed inside the boundary. So we see subject and system called out here. The subject is a user who wishes to access a resource, and a system is a non-human entity, often the device used by the user to access the resource. And then we have the policy enforcement point. When a user or system requests access to a resource, the policy enforcement point evaluates it against predefined policies and applies the necessary controls. Microsoft Entra ID is a good example of a policy enforcement point. So we're going to visualize these concepts a couple of different ways for context. So let's consider conditional access in Entra ID. So the system will look at the signals around the request. The user, their location, the device, the application, the real-time risk of that user. If the user's current risk level is high based on recent activities, that's going to influence the decision. It will verify every access attempt. It may just allow access if conditions are good. It may require MFA, some additional authentication to deal with any concerns around location, device, or risk, or it may block access altogether. But if the user meets the bar, if all the conditions of the request are acceptable, they'll gain access to the apps and data they're requesting. So let's look at a logical diagram of the zero trust concept we've been talking about here. So we have the control plane and the data plane. And in the data plane, we have the policy enforcement point. In the control plane, we have the policy decision point. which is comprised of the policy engine and the policy administrator. We have our system and subject, which make the request, and the policy enforcement point will enforce the final decision there and, if granted, give the subject and system access to the enterprise resource. There are certainly many supporting systems and functions here, from identity management to PKI, data access policies, activity logs, threat intelligence. But these are the core components. So the policy enforcement point is where security controls are applied. It's where they are enforced. And the decisions are made in the policy decision point. So we talked about concepts like adaptive identity. So I want to give you a quick tour of conditional access in Microsoft Entra ID so you can see how those conditions around access come together in a policy. But again, this is just for context to help you connect the dots. Security Plus is vendor agnostic. So I'm going to switch over to a browser and I'll go to the Microsoft Entra Admin Center. And I will look for the conditional access area. I will look at the policies. And we'll take a look at an existing policy. So Exchange Online requires compliant device. So I'll look at the settings of this policy so you can get a sense of the conditions. You see here I can apply this to specific users, all users, or specific users and groups. I can exclude specific users and groups if I wish. I can specify the target resources. In this case, we're targeting Exchange Online, so I could target this to as much as all my cloud apps. I can go very broad or very narrow. And then when I look at my conditions here, I see I can look at the user risk, for example. So I can make decisions based on the user's risk level. And I can look at their sign-in risk. So if we have concerns about the sign-in itself, but you'll notice here it mentions the sign-in risk level is generated based on all real-time risk detections. I can apply this to specific device platforms. You see I can drill down and apply a policy that applies only to Windows or Mac or Android or iOS, for example. And we can look at locations. So I can exclude trusted locations if I wish. Maybe I don't want to prompt users for additional authentication factors when they're on a managed device in a known trusted location like the corporate office. We get sign-in fatigue and unhappy users when we're overdoing it in that respect. So we have to establish our boundaries based on our competence. And I'll go over here and look at my access control. So I can grant access based on conditions here. So I can grant access, but I can require multi-factor authentication, require a specific strength of authentication. I can require a device to be marked as compliant or to be joined to my organization, like joined to my Entra organization, for example. I can require an approved app, and you'll notice I can require any one of these selected controls, or I can apply them all and say you must meet all of these conditions. And the more sensitive the operation, the more likely I'm going to go that route of requiring multiple conditions in that respect. But that's how adaptive identity flows in the Microsoft ecosystem, but you'll find similar concepts across many platforms out there. So if you don't have any exposure, hopefully that gives you a bit of context. So let's move on to physical security. It's important to remember there is no security without physical security. Without control over the physical environment, no amount of administrative or technical access controls can provide adequate security. If a malicious person can gain physical access to your facility or your equipment, they can do just about anything they want, from destruction of property to disclosure and alteration. So physical security is that first outer layer of protection. And we'll go through the physical security controls mentioned in the exam syllabus in order, beginning with the bollard, which is a short, sturdy, vertical post, usually made of concrete, steel, or some heavy-duty material. They can be fixed in place or retractable, but they act as physical barriers, preventing vehicles from forcibly entering a restricted area. They often delineate pedestrian areas, parking lots, and sensitive zones to minimize accidental damage, but they're primarily used to control traffic flow and protect buildings or areas from vehicle-based attacks. Next, we have the access control vestibule, which is a physical security system comprising a small space with two interlocking doors, only one of which can be open at a time. It's designed to strictly control access to highly secure areas by allowing only one person at a time to pass through. This will protect against tailgating, where a user slips through an entry based on someone else's badge when they themselves don't have a badge. This also prevents piggybacking, which is just like tailgating, but typically with bad intent to gain access to a restricted area. You don't really need to be too worried about the details between those two. They both describe a situation where somebody tries to follow someone with a badge into a system without using a badge of their own. And the access control vestibule will really help block unauthorized access of any kind. You may have previously heard the access control vestibule called a man trap. The naming has been updated in recent years, but two names for the same thing. So fences are called out on the exam. So let's talk about the characteristics of fences. Typically, efficacy comes down to their height and their composition. So a fence of 3 to 4 feet deters the casual trespasser. A 6 to 7 foot fence is too difficult to climb easily. It might block vision, which provides additional security if folks standing on the ground can't see what's behind the fence. On the other hand, an 8-foot fence topped with barbed wire will deter determined intruders. And then we could even employ what's called a PDAS, a perimeter intrusion detection and assessment system, which will detect someone attempting to climb a fence. PDAS is an expensive control and it may generate false positives. So a fence tends to be a deterrent control and PDAS is a detective control. Focus on fence for the exam. But to augment fences, some orgs may also erect stronger barricades or zigzag paths to prevent a vehicle from ramming a gate. So really think of that as a layered defense, as defense in depth, where we're adding additional supporting controls, compensating controls of a fashion if we go back to our previous installment. So next we have video surveillance. So cameras and closed-circuit TV systems can provide video surveillance and reliable proof of a person's identity and activity. And many cameras nowadays include motion and object detection capabilities, which will kick them into action when necessary, when there's activity to capture. That makes combing through camera footage for meaningful events much easier after the fact. We have security guards, a preventive physical security control, and they can prevent unauthorized personnel from entering a secure area. They can recognize people and compare an individual's picture ID for people they don't recognize. Access badges can electronically unlock a door and help prevent unauthorized personnel from entering a secure area. So if we were to put a label on these, video is detective, security guards are preventive, access badges are preventive. Maybe you can see how each may also serve to deter potential attacks. Just like a lock is a psychological barrier as well as a physical barrier that may deter bad behavior, a video camera can do the same thing. If someone sees that video camera, they may simply think twice. It discourages them from acting. With lighting, we need to think about location, efficiency, and protection. So in terms of location, installing lights at all entrances and exits to a building can deter attackers from trying to break in. In terms of efficiency, a combination of automation, light dimmers, and motion sensors can save on electricity costs without sacrificing security. They can automatically turn on at dusk, automatically turn off at dawn. They can even be motion detecting. And we need to protect the lights. If an attacker can remove the light bulbs, it defeats the control. If the attacker can break the light bulb, it defeats the control. So either place the lights high enough that they can't be reached or protect them with a metal cage. And your lighting is a deterrent control. There are 4 types of sensors called out in the syllabus. The first is infrared, which detects heat signatures in the form of infrared radiation emitted by people, animals, or objects. Infrared sensors are often integrated into security cameras and alarm systems to improve detection capabilities. Next, we have pressure sensors, which are designed to detect changes in pressure on a surface or in a specific area, such as a person walking on a floor or stepping on a mat. Pressure sensors are used in access control systems to ensure that only authorized individuals can enter. Microwave sensors use microwave technology to detect movement within a specific area. They're often used with other types of sensors to reduce false alarms. Ultrasonic sensors emit high-frequency sound waves and measure the time it takes for the sound waves to bounce back after hitting an object or a surface. Ultrasonic sensors are commonly used in parking assistance, robotic navigation, and intrusion detection. And in the category of deception and disruption, we have the honeypot. Honeypots lure bad people into doing bad things. It lets you watch them. But honeypots should only entice, not entrap. You're not allowed under U.S. law to let them download items with enticement if you want your evidence to be admissible in court. For example, allowing them to download a fake payroll file might be considered entrapment. The goal of a honeypot is really to distract from real assets and isolate in a padded cell until you can track them down. A group of honeypots is called a honey net. Be familiar with both of these for the exam. Then we have the honey file, which is a decoy file deceptively named so it attracts the attention of an attacker. And then the honey token is a fake record inserted into a database to detect data theft. These are all intended to deceive attackers and disrupt attackers and divert them from live networks and allow observation of our security team. The goals are to detect, isolate, and observe. And congratulations, you've made it through section 1.2 of the Security Plus Exam Cram series. I hope you're liking the series so far. Remember, if you have questions, ping me in the comments here on YouTube. Reach out directly on LinkedIn. Happy to help where I can. And I'll look forward to seeing you for 1.3 here in a couple of days. And until next time, take care and stay safe.